I was sitting at her kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, when she said it. Miriam leaned back in her chair, arms folded, and looked at me the way someone looks at something they've already decided has no value. "You'll never amount to anything," she said. Not loudly. Not even unkindly exactly. Just flatly, the way you state a fact you've long since stopped questioning. "Your life will always be mediocre. My son deserves better than mediocre." I didn't respond. I set the mug down carefully and kept my face still while something hot and sharp moved through my chest. Then she slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a loan application. Her name at the top. A blank signature line near the bottom with a small arrow sticker pointing at it. "Sign this," she said, "or I cut him off completely. Your choice. My name is, and I am 41 Vivian years old. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going." I walked out of her house without signing anything. The afternoon air was cool, and I stood on her front step for a moment, folder in hand, letting the cold settle around me before I moved toward my car. My ex, Dominic, had not been home. That was not an accident. Miriam had chosen her moment carefully. Just the two of us, no witness, no buffer. She had been doing that for 3 years. Arranging situations where I was alone and she held all the advantage. I drove home slowly thinking. She had assumed, as she always assumed, that I would comply. That the combination of pressure and her son's well-being would be enough to make me fold quietly and do what she asked. She had called me mediocre. She had handed me paperwork and told me to sign it or else. Somewhere between her driveway and my apartment, a thought settled in my mind, clear and calm. What if I didn't just refuse, but turn this around entirely? I spent that evening at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the loan folder beside it. I read every page carefully. The loan was a business loan, a significant one, tied to a property Miriam wanted to develop. The application listed multiple co-signers and guarantors. My name had been added, apparently, because my credit score and employment history strengthened the overall application in a way that Miriam's finances alone did not. She needed me. She simply hadn't bothered to say so politely. I pulled up the bank's public information, their loan policies, the terms and conditions listed on their website. I cross-referenced the figures in the application against publicly available property records. I took notes on everything. Dates, amounts, terms, discrepancies. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud and unfocused. What I felt now was something quieter and more useful. I was building a toolkit, and she had no idea I had started. 2 days later, my phone rang. A number I recognized, Pauline, a friend from my previous job who had moved into financial advisory work 3 years ago. We hadn't spoken in months, so the timing felt strange. I answered, and after a few minutes of catching up, I told her broadly what was happening. Not everything, just enough to get her read on the situation. She went quiet for a moment. "So she needs your signature to strengthen a loan application," Pauline said slowly. "And she insulted you before asking." "That's about right," I said. Another pause. Then she said, "You have more leverage here than you realize. She came to you. That means she needs something only you can provide. That's not weakness, that's a position." She offered to look over the loan documents if I wanted a second set of eyes. Before we hung up, she said quietly, almost to herself, "You could make this genuinely unforgettable." That night I let myself go back. Not to wallow, I had made a rule about wallowing years ago and I kept it, but to look clearly at what had actually happened over 3 years with Dominic and his mother, the way you look at an old photograph to understand something you were too close to see at the time. Miriam had never approved of me. She had never said so directly, not at first. It came through in smaller things, the way she addressed questions about my career with a slight pause, as if deciding whether my answer was worth listening to. The way she spoke about Dominic's future without ever including me in the picture she was describing. Dominic had noticed. He had also consistently chosen not to address it. That had hurt more than anything Miriam had said directly. But sitting at my kitchen table now, the loan documents beside me, and Pauline's words still in my head, I understood something clearly. Their assumptions about me had always been their greatest vulnerability. I started making quiet changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that announced itself. I reviewed my own financial profile, my credit report, my employment documentation, the accounts I kept. Everything was already in reasonable order, but I made it better. I paid down a small outstanding balance ahead of schedule. I requested an updated credit report and reviewed it line by line. I was building a picture of someone capable and credible, because I was that person, and it was time to make sure the paperwork reflected it clearly. Miriam, meanwhile, appeared to believe the process was simply paused while I came to my senses. She called on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice had the particular smoothness it took on when she wanted something and was pretending the wanting was reasonable. I let her speak. She explained again why the signature was necessary, why it would benefit everyone. When she finished, I said calmly and without apology, "I haven't made a decision yet." The silence on her end was very satisfying. Her next move was an email. Formal, precise, with a deadline bolded in the second paragraph. My signature was required by the following Friday, or the application timeline would be compromised. She framed it as information rather than pressure, which was a technique I had seen her use before, wrapping demands in the language of logistics. I read it twice, then pulled out the loan documents again. Pauline had gone through them the previous weekend and flagged several items worth noting. The application was not as clean as Miriam believed it to be. There were gaps in the supporting documentation, projected income figures that relied on assumptions rather than confirmed contracts, a property valuation that was on the optimistic end of what the recent market data suggested. None of these were my problems to solve. But one item was interesting in a specific way. The application required all listed cosigners to submit independently verified financial statements. Miriam had listed me without confirming I had agreed. That was not how the process was supposed to work. Pauline confirmed what I had suspected. Listing a cosigner on a loan application without their documented consent was, at minimum, a procedural problem. At worst, depending on how the bank interpreted it, it could raise questions about the accuracy and integrity of the overall application. I was not going to report Miriam. That was not my goal, and it never had been. But I was going to understand exactly what I was dealing with, every detail, every vulnerability, every place where her overconfidence had made her careless. I spent the following week compiling everything into a clear, organized document. Public records. The bank's stated application requirements, pulled directly from their website. Pauline's notes on the financial projections. I kept it factual, unemotional, the kind of document that speaks for itself. Miriam had built her certainty on the belief that I would not look too closely. She had lived her whole life assuming that people like me didn't look closely. She had been wrong about that from the beginning. Dominic called me on a Wednesday evening, which surprised me. We had been broken up for 4 months and our contact had been minimal, occasional, polite, and brief. He sounded tired. He said he didn't want to get in the middle of whatever was happening between me and his mother, but that she had mentioned I hadn't signed yet and he was worried about her financial situation. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked him one question. Did he know his mother had listed me as a co-signer on the application before asking whether I agreed? A long pause. She said you'd already agreed in principle, he said slowly. I was sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee, I said. She told me I'd never amount to anything. Then she slid the papers across the table. Another silence. Longer this time. Dominic had always been more perceptive than he let himself act on. I could hear him processing, putting pieces together that his loyalty to Miriam had prevented him from assembling before. He had just become, without intending to, a key part of how this would end. I called the bank. Not to report anything. Not to make accusations. I simply called their general inquiries line and asked several questions as a prospective cosigner trying to understand my obligations and rights before making a decision. The representative was helpful. She walked me through the process. What cosigning legally entailed, what documentation the bank required from all parties, and importantly, what the bank's procedure was when a listed cosigner had not yet formally confirmed their participation. It was exactly what I had suspected based on my research. The bank's process required independent confirmation from every listed party. If that confirmation hadn't been obtained, the application had a procedural gap. At the end of the call, I mentioned casually that I had some questions about the projected financials in a specific application and whether the bank's team reviewed those independently or relied on applicant-submitted documentation. The representative's tone shifted just slightly. "We can certainly arrange a meeting to discuss any concerns," she said carefully. I made an appointment for the following week. There was a neighborhood association event that weekend, the kind of informal community gathering that happened every few months in the area where Miriam lived. I had attended twice with Dominic when we were together. I decided to attend again. Not to confront anyone. Not to make a scene. I simply went, dressed well, and spent 2 hours being exactly myself, talking to people I knew, asking about their lives, listening properly. At some point, the conversation turned to finances, the way it often does in rooms full of homeowners and small business people. Someone mentioned the difficulty of securing development loans in the current market. I contributed calmly and knowledgeably, drawing on what I had spent the last 2 weeks learning. Miriam arrived midway through the event. I noticed her notice me, the slight double take, the recalibration in her expression. She had not expected me to be there. She had certainly not expected me to be standing in a comfortable circle of people, speaking with quiet authority about the exact subject her loan depended on. Her smile, when she composed it, was a half-second too late. An old colleague of mine named Bernard reached out that same week. He had spent 20 years in commercial banking before moving into consulting, and we had stayed loosely connected through professional networks. He had seen something I posted online, a general comment about cosigner rights in loan agreements, and reached out to ask if I needed guidance. We met for coffee, and I walked him through the situation in broad terms. He nodded slowly as I spoke. When I finished, he said, "The bank will always prefer a clean application over a complicated one. If there are procedural questions, they'd rather resolve them early than discover problems during underwriting." He gave me specific language to use in my meeting. Professional, precise, non-accusatory. The language of someone who understood the process and was simply asking appropriate questions. That same evening, Miriam texted me. Short and sharp. Asterisk, I need your answer. This week, asterisk. I read it, set my phone face down on the table, and went back to preparing for my bank meeting. The meeting was on a Tuesday morning. I arrived 5 minutes early, dressed professionally, with a printed folder containing my questions and the relevant documentation I had gathered. The loan officer who met with me was a thorough, serious woman named Ms. Bankole, who clearly preferred directness. I was direct. I explained that I had been listed as a cosigner on an application without prior formal consent. I explained that I had questions about the procedural requirements for cosigner confirmation. I also noted, calmly and without dramatics, that I had reviewed the publicly available property valuation data for the development site and had some questions about how the projected figures in the application compared to current market conditions. Ms. Bankole took careful notes throughout. At the end of the meeting, she thanked me and said the bank would need to review the application file before proceeding further. She did not say anything else. She didn't need to. 2 days later, Dominic called me. His voice was careful and quiet. "The bank called my mother," he said. "They've paused the review." The following Saturday, there was a larger neighborhood gathering, a fundraiser for a local school that drew a wider crowd than the association events. I went. I helped set up chairs. I talked to people. At some point during the afternoon, a small group formed around a conversation about financial literacy, specifically about how ordinary people could better understand loan agreements and their rights before signing anything. Someone had apparently been through a difficult experience with the co-signing situation and wanted to understand it better. I contributed to the conversation naturally, sharing what I had learned over the past weeks in plain and accessible language. I was not performing for Miriam. She wasn't even there at that point. But word travels in neighborhoods. It always does. By the time Miriam heard, through whatever channel she heard it through, that I had been calmly and publicly discussing cosigner rights and loan application procedures, the information hit differently than it would have a month earlier. She knew by now that I had been to the bank. She knew the review had paused. She was beginning, finally, to understand that I was not what she had decided I was. The calls started coming every other day. Then every day. then twice in one day. I did not answer all of them. When I did answer, I was polite and brief. I had nothing new to tell her, I said. I was still considering my options. I would be in touch when I had something to communicate. The calm in my voice seemed to frustrate her more than any argument could have. Dominic told me, during one of our check-ins, that she was not sleeping well, that she was snapping at people around her, that the confident certainty she normally carried everywhere had developed visible cracks. He said it with concern for his mother, which I respected. But he also said it with something else underneath, a quiet recognition that the version of events she had always presented to him was not the complete one. She said you'd agreed to sign, he said again, as if still working through it. She assumed I would, I said gently. That's different. He was quiet for a long moment. Yeah, he said finally. I'm starting to see that. I sent a formal letter to the bank. Pauline helped me draft it over 2 evenings, reviewing every sentence to make sure the language was precise, professional, and unarguable. It was not an accusation. It was a structured summary of my concerns as a listed party, the procedural gap in consent documentation, the questions about the property valuation methodology, and a request for clarification on how the bank planned to verify the income projections submitted by the applicant. It was 4 pages long. It cited the bank's own published lending guidelines twice. I sent it by registered mail and kept the receipt. The bank's response came within a week. They thanked me for raising the concerns and informed me that certain aspects of the application had been placed on hold pending additional review. They requested supplementary documentation from the primary applicant. Miriam received that request on the same day I received my copy of the bank's response. She had walked into this believing she held all the power. She had assumed I would sign quietly and that would be the end of it. Her certainty was gone now. And I had barely raised my voice. She called me that evening. I recognized the shift immediately. The smooth confidence that normally shaped every word she spoke was gone. What replaced it was something thinner and less practiced, the voice of someone who had run out of prepared material and was speaking from a place of genuine need. Please, she said. I need this loan. I need your signature. The bank is asking for things I can't. Just sign, and I'll handle the rest. I let the silence sit for a moment before I responded. Miriam, I said, do you trust me? A pause. What? You sat across from me in your kitchen and told me I would never amount to anything. You listed me on a legal document without asking my permission. You gave me a deadline and told me to comply. Another silence. Longer. Do you trust me? I asked again quietly. Because trust is the foundation of a co-signing agreement. And you've never once extended that to me. She didn't answer. I told her I would think about what, if anything, I was willing to do. And I ended the call. I called Pauline the next morning and we talked through my options carefully. There was a path forward that could work, for both of us technically. Not out of mercy, and not out of lingering attachment to Dominic or any desire to help Miriam personally. But because the path that helped her also, in a structured and documented way, protected me completely and established terms that corrected the imbalance she had created. I was willing to engage with the bank directly, as a properly consenting and informed cosigner, if and only if 3 conditions were met. First, the application had to be corrected to reflect accurate and verified financial projections. No inflated figures, no optimistic assumptions. Second, my legal rights and limitations as a cosigner had to be explicitly documented and agreed upon in writing by all parties. Third, I required a written acknowledgement from Miriam that the consent process had not been followed correctly from the start. That last condition was the one I knew would be hardest for her. Not because it was legally significant, though Ms. Bankole had noted it would help clarify the file, but because signing it meant admitting on paper that she had been wrong. Dominic came to see me in person. He sat in my living room with a cup of tea he didn't drink and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time, open, uncertain, without the careful blankness he used when he was managing competing loyalties. He said his mother had told him about my conditions. That she was resistant, particularly to the third one. I nodded. I had expected that. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Did she treat you the way you've described? Consistently? Because she's always told me you were oversensitive about her. I looked at him for a moment. Then I got up, went to my desk, and pulled out a folder I had kept, a habit of organization that had always annoyed him slightly when we were together. Inside were printed emails, screenshots of text messages, and a timeline I had put together for my own reference going back 18 months. I handed it to him and sat back down. He read quietly for several minutes. When he looked up, his face had changed. "She was wrong about you," he said. "About all of it." Miriam discovered, through Ms. Bankel at the bank, that I had already been in contact with a financial advisor and had outlined an alternative approach to the application, one that addressed the valuation questions and income projection gaps, brought the documentation in line with what the bank actually required, and strengthened rather than weakened the overall file. I had done this not as a gift to Miriam, but as a demonstration. The bank, presented with a cleaner and more credible version of the same underlying application, was interested. Ms. Bankel called me directly to discuss next steps. Miriam found out through a follow-up call she made to check on the status of her paused application. The bank informed her that the file was being reconsidered in light of updated documentation submitted by a listed party. That listed party was me. Pauline told me later that Miriam had called her own advisor in a panic, convinced that I was somehow taking the loan from her. I wasn't. I was simply demonstrating in the most concrete possible way that her original assessment of me had been wrong in every direction. The community brunch happened on a Sunday in early spring at a restaurant near the neighborhood association building. I hadn't planned to go, but Pauline convinced me, and I was glad she did. Word had gotten around, the way word always gets around in communities where people pay attention to each other's business, that the development loan Miriam had been pursuing had been restructured significantly. That the version now moving forward was cleaner, better documented, and more viable than the original application. People knew I had been involved. Not the details, I hadn't shared those, but the general shape of it. At some point during brunch, someone turned to me and said, "I heard you helped sort out a pretty complicated loan situation. Is that right?" I said it had been a process, and that I was glad it was moving in a better direction. Miriam was seated at the far end of the table. She didn't say anything. She looked at her plate and then at the window and then at her hands. I didn't look at her with satisfaction. I didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself, quietly and completely. She called me one final time before the loan was finalized. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before, stripped of the smooth authority, stripped of the rehearsed confidence, stripped of the particular edge she used when she wanted to remind me of my place. She asked if I would sign the corrected application, under the terms I had outlined. All 3 conditions. I asked her to confirm she understood each one. She did. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone reading from a document they would rather not be reading from. "And the written acknowledgement?" I asked. A long pause. "Yes," she said. I told her I would be in touch with Ms. Bankel to confirm the next steps. Before I ended the call, I said one thing more. "Miriam, I never wanted to harm you. I wanted you to see me accurately. There's a difference." She didn't respond for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "I understand that now." I ended the call and sat still in my apartment for a while. The bank finalized the loan 3 weeks later. The corrected application was clean, properly documented, and accurately represented. The income projections had been revised to reflect verified data rather than optimistic assumptions. The property valuation question had been addressed with updated comparable sales figures. It was a better loan than the original in every measurable way. Miriam got her development financing. The project moved forward. My conditions had been met in full. The written acknowledgement sat in my files, signed and dated, alongside everything else I had documented over the past 2 months. I did not attend any closing celebration. I was not invited, and I would not have gone regardless. This had never been about being in the room when things went well. It had been about something simpler and more important, making sure the room understood who I was before I decided whether to help at all. Miriam's reputation in the community did not collapse, but it shifted. The unquestioned authority she had always carried among people who knew her was quieter now, more questioned. Her arrogance had run directly into its consequences. Softly, permanently. Dominic called me the week after the loan closed. He said his mother had shown him the written acknowledgement she had signed, that she had done it without being asked by him, had brought it out and placed it on the table in front of him while they were having dinner, and explained in her own words what had happened. He said it was the first time in his life he had seen her admit she had been completely wrong about something. He also said something I hadn't expected. He told me that watching how I had handled everything, the calmness, the preparation, the refusal to retaliate or reduce myself, had changed how he understood what I was capable of. That he had spent 3 years listening to his mother's version of me, and it had shaped how he treated me in ways he was only now fully seeing. He said he was sorry. I accepted that simply and without needing him to say more. Some apologies you carry forward rather than backward. People around them, neighbors, community members, Miriam's own acquaintances, had begun, quietly, to question things they had previously accepted without much thought. On a quiet Saturday morning, I made coffee at my own kitchen table. Good coffee in the mug I liked best, with the window open slightly to let in the spring air. The loan was closed. The documents were filed. The acknowledgement sat in my folder. Pauline and I had celebrated with dinner the previous week. Nothing extravagant, just good food and a long conversation about what came next. What came next was simply my life. Continuing. Growing. Moving in the directions I chose. I had not broken a single rule. I had not acted out of revenge or spite or the desire to watch someone fall. I had protected myself, asked fair questions, and demonstrated, through actions, not arguments, exactly who I was. Miriam called that afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but I did. She said simply and without preamble, "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." No explanation. No context. Just those 2 sentences offered plainly. I thanked her. I meant it. And then I finished my coffee in the quiet of my own home, unhurried and unshaken, already looking forward.